Hi, this is Clare and welcome to another Hero Arts video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make this card set using a technique I call focal background. To start out with, we're going to take this color layering bouquet stamp set, and this stamp set is, as its name suggests, a layering stamp set. So this is how it would look if you used it as intended. But with these stamps you can do whatever you want with them. So I really liked the leaf part of this image, and I thought it would be really beautiful on a sympathy stamp set, so that's what I used it for. So even though the stamp is a focal point, I decided to kind of use it to make a background, except this background isn't quite a background. It's a little bit, it kind of steals the show a little bit, so that's why I call it focal background. Alright, so we're going to take this with Deepest Sympathy stamp set, and I'm just going to stamp it on a clear piece of acetate to use my Stamp-A-Majig so I can position the sentiment later. I actually lost the thick piece of acetate that came with my Stamp-A-Majig, so I just use a clear acetate envelope instead. Alright, once I stamped it on the envelope, I'm going to stamp off onto a full sticky post-it note, and then I'm just going to kind of trim around the sentiment. What I'm using this mask for is kind of as a guide to where I want to position my sentiment later after I stamp the image, and also to make sure when I'm stamping the image that I don't stamp in that area. If you wanted to, you could stamp your sentiment first, but the reason I opted not to with these cards is because when you cover these panels with the anti-static powder, because we're going to be doing a lot of embossing, they will stick and they will kind of dull the intense black of the ink. So that's why I decided to stamp the sentiment after I had done all the embossing, because if I stamped it first, I would have to cover it with my anti-static powder, otherwise the embossing powder would be sticking to the sentiment as well. And then that anti-static powder would kind of dull the black. So that's why I masked them off. So once I have my craft panel embossed in blue, I'm just going to use that Stamp-A-Majig to position my sentiment and then go ahead and stamp that in some Hero Arts black ink. We're going to be doing pretty much the same process for this next panel with the blue, except we'll be doing white heat embossing. Now, one of the reasons I love this leaf image is that it covers a large surface pretty easily without creating very many pockets. However, with this blue panel, I did have one little pocket of an unstamped area, so I just selectively inked my image and then covered it with embossing powder and just heat embossed it like that. Make sure you heat emboss the rest of your images first before you do the selective embossing, otherwise the stamp that you're stamping, if it's a large one like I'm using, it might kind of pick up the embossing powders from the surrounding area. So make sure the rest of the surrounding area is already heat embossed. So that finishes the blue panel. We'll just stamp that sentiment and then we'll get started on for the white panel. Now for the white panel, I didn't have a matching craft ink with me. So what I did instead was I took a distress ink, and that was Vintage Photo, and then I used a generation technique. So I stamped off once, and then I stamped the second impression on the card base, and that gave me the perfect craft color. The nice thing about using these distress inks as well is because by their property they are a sticky kind of ink. They're not as sticky as Versamark, but they're pretty sticky still. And you can actually do heat embossing with them. So I covered this with clear embossing powder because I didn't have any craft embossing powder. And you won't get as clean or as crisp as an impression as if you had used Versamark ink, but you'll still get a pretty decent impression. And really for this panel, all I wanted to get was a kind of embossed look to kind of match with the rest of the panels, and it didn't really matter if it wasn't super clear or crisp because the ink was below the embossing, so the embossing was clear and you couldn't really tell too much unless you really were looking for it, that it wasn't super crisp. Alright, so with those panels, I'm just trimming them down. I have their matching alternating card bases. And then I'm going to take strips of cardstock in white and craft, and I'm going to make strips to go above and below the sentiment for each one of the panels. I wanted these strips to exactly match the embossing, so I actually had to emboss each of these strips. So for the first strip, I just covered it with Versamark. When I do this, I really smush the Versamark against the paper, and then I kind of smear it out. So I smush it first to get all the ink on there, and then smear it out to get an even impression. I covered this first one with the blue embossing powder, then I cut that apart, and I did the same for the white. It might seem a little bit overkill for the white since, you could just use white cardstock, but I really did want the shine of the embossing to match for the images and for the strips. The craft was a little bit tricky because if you use Versamark, it will darken the paper. That's just the nature of Versamark. It will kind of whatever you stamp will kind of be a darker impression on the cardstock. So I like that for most cards, but for this it wasn't really working. It was darkening the craft strips too much, and then it didn't match the craft ink. So what I did is I sprayed it with just some spray adhesive and then covered it with clear embossing powder. It wasn't quite as crisp as an impression as you would get with the Versamark again, but it was still pretty crisp, so I decided to go with that. It matched really well, so that's what I was going for. Now once I have cut all these strips, adhere them to their panels, I'm going to adhere those main panels to the card bases and then just top them off with some matching pearls. One of the things I really like about this card set is the fact that it's made and it's done and it's out of the way. So when the time comes that I need to use these, I don't have to make them, because that's kind of the hardest time to actually make these type of cards. So it's nice to just have them out of the way. If you wanted to, you could use the different parts of the color layering bouquet to create that focal background. You can use different sentiments. It's a pretty fun set, so just play with it. Here are the cards individually, and I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions or comments, then you can leave them on the blog or you can leave them on this YouTube video. And the supplies will be listed on the blog and on this video. Thank you for watching and have a great day. God bless. Bye.